Hi, so we're going to deal with Jung revisited, but you're going to see a very different point of view presented by a mathematician, Edward Frenkel. So let's get into it.
This is Frenkel presenting Jung's point of view.
So here we have a picture of Edward Frenkel, and he wrote a very popular book called Love and Math. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, but he also wrote some heavy-duty pure math books, as you can see, vertex algebra and algebraic curves and the Langlands correspondence for loop groups. And he has a whole series of videos now on YouTube. And we're going to be picking up on one of those. So let's take a look. Here we go.
And is he Australian?
He's Russian.
Russian. Shows what his accent sounded.
Edward Vladimirovich Frenkel, born 1968, and he works in mathematics, and he's at the University of California at Berkeley. And so he is known for works that he did in algebra, and he's very much interested in quantum mechanics and mathematical physics. So he did some other work there. And then finally, there was some work on what's called the geometric Langlands correspondence. We talked about Langlands proposing in the 1967 timeframe a program for looking at linkages between various disparate areas of mathematics. And he started with number theory and said it would be linked to harmonic analysis, which of course threw everyone for a loop, except the best of the best said, no, I think we can do that. And then there are a variety of things that have happened since then. To pick up here, what Frenkel worked on was geometry and how geometry enters into this. So if you can imagine what the linkages between number theory, harmonic analysis, and geometry, good luck.
But it is all.
This Langlands program has over 1,000 mathematicians on planet Earth right now working on it. It's probably the single biggest area of activity because mathematics, to many people, for millennia, was just thought to be these different areas: number theory, harmonic analysis, geometry, algebra, and there are these islands or continents, and there was no thought that there would be linkages or bridges between them. And that's now coming into focus through this comprehensive program. He also introduced some novel work in geometry in particular that we're not going to touch on here, but all of this, you can see he's a heavy-duty mathematician. The book that's accessible here is the book he wrote that was published in October 2013, Love and Math, The Heart of Hidden Reality. And it's available on Amazon if you're interested. In a review, it was called The Winsome New Memoir, with three things: a platonic love letter to mathematics, an attempt to give the layman some idea of its most magnificent drama in progress, and an autobiographical accounts, by turns inspiring and also droll, how the author himself became a leading player in this drama. So this gives you some idea of who he is. Different reviews said, with every page, I found my mind's eye conjuring up a fictional image of the book's author, writing by candlelight in the depths of the Siberian winter, like Omar Sharif's Dr. Zhivago in the David Lean movie that was the adaptation of Pasternak's novel. Love and Math is Edward Frenkel's Laura poems. As is true for all great Russian novels, you'll find in Frenkel's tale one person's individual story of love and overcoming adversity provides both a penetrating lens on society and a revealing mirror into the human mind. A mathematician at Columbia University, Peter White, wrote that the love of the title is much more about the love of mathematics than the love of another person. Frenkel provides a detailed story of what it's like to fall in love with mathematics, then pursue this deeply, ending up doing mathematics at the highest level.
Well, that's not even wrong. That's from
Yeah, his website is Not Even Wrong, which he took from Wolfgang Pauli. Peter White has been very down on the advances in mathematical physics over the last 50 years and everything based on string theory. And he feels that they could have done much better. I tend to disagree with him, but that's for different reasons. So Frenkel's now put out a podcast, which he calls Aftermath. So our minds are connected. In the first podcast, you want to move that out of the way, our minds are connected by mathematics. Now, this is starting to, you're starting to see where the tie-ins with Carl Jung come in. In his first podcast, which you can get on YouTube, he explored the revolutionary ideas in mathematics, quantum physics, philosophy, and Jungian psychology, as well as the interconnections between these subjects. And he explains, based on mathematics, that our minds are connected to each other at a much deeper level than is ordinarily understood. So what is that connection? Well, suppose that you, for example, in mathematics, you take a class in geometry, and it's based on Euclid's work, and you read a theorem there. So you read the theorem, and I read the theorem. Now, you're you, and I'm me. But our minds are going to read the theorem, and our minds are going to be connected to each other in the sense that we each agree that the theorem is correct. The only way that this could be true is if we have a common framework, or if we're connected to one another in some way. That's what his argument is. So in the second podcast, which is the one we're going to deal with here, there's a unification of mathematics and analytical psychology. So following Jung, he proposes that all mathematical objects and ideas come from archetypes in our collective unconscious, which is a common psychic realm to which our individual minds are connected. After a brief introduction to Jungian psychology covering such topics as the collective unconscious and its building blocks called the archetypes, with special attention to the archetype of the shadow, Frenkel talks about a specific mathematical archetype, the archetype of flat space, and he explains what it means for humans to be under the spell of this archetype, what it means to project this archetype, what it means to integrate this archetype. And he argues that when we integrate mathematical archetypes, new dimensions of reality open up to us. So again, to go back to the example of Euclid and geometry, Euclid started off and talked about points. Well, the points that Euclid talked about are points that have no that have no size to them. Well, we can't draw any such point. We take a pencil and we put a point down. It's got some physical size to it. Take a pen, do whatever we can. We always end up with a point that has some physical size, but Euclid talked about points that have no size. Similarly, Euclid talked about lines. Well, the lines that Euclid talked about are straight lines. We can't draw a straight line. Try and draw a straight line, and then zoom in on it, and you'll see it's a little jagged. It isn't straight. And furthermore, Euclid's straight lines went forever. And so we started off with no dimensions, which is a point, one dimension, which is a line, and the next one is a 2 dimensions, which is a plane. So we take a plane, and it's infinite, it's flat, and it goes on in all dimensions, goes off in all directions forever. There is no such thing. What is it? We can imagine it. Our minds can imagine it, but we can't show one. Whatever we try and do to create a plane that is in our world is finite. It doesn't go forever. But we are able to deal with these concepts, and so that's really what he's talking about here. So now I'm going to let Marjorie take over, and we're going to crank up Mr. Frenkel.
So what he's saying is that we're pre-programmed for these a priori concepts that we could call Platonic.
Yeah, Platonic concepts.
Ideals.
Plato's idea of forms, or Jung's idea of archetypes that shape ourselves and our world around us. So,
because if we drew a line on the surface of the Earth, it would ultimately become a circle.
Right.
Because it would go around the Earth.
If it was on the surface of the Earth, right?
The surface of the Earth,
right.
It would be describing that sphere, because it can't go forever on that coordinate, on that. So he's saying that we are hardwired for. There's a place here I'm going to ask to pause it to just emphasize something, because I think a lot of people have a lot of preconceived misunderstandings about what Jung even means by an archetype. And I think what he's talking about is very pure. It's very abstract, but in a way that makes it more pure. And I think he's closer to what Jung is talking about. You may not see it when you think of, the mother or the shadow or the teacher or something like that, but I think it's very similar. And what he's saying is that there's something universal in the substrata of our minds, not necessarily our brains, but our minds, that's hardwired to perceive things in this way.
And Frenkel views that to be mathematics. So what we call mathematics, right, we're all disposed toward, and mathematics encompasses these forms that we all share with one another, these archetypes you all share with one another, and you can judge for yourself.
And so in that way, they're universal.
So go ahead.
Which is another definition of an archetype.
Right.
Is that it's not culturally dependent, it's universal to all cultures.
So go down and hit the start down here.
Here we are.
In this episode, I'm going to talk about a unification of two subjects that seem to be far apart, mathematics and psychology. Specifically, the analytic psychology developed by Carl Jung and his school in the 20th century. One of the main tenets of analytic psychology is that each individual mind is connected to a common psychic substrate that Carl Jung called collective unconscious, whose building blocks are the archetypes, the structures of the psyche that are common and universal to all humans. You may have heard about such archetypes as shadow, anima, animus, and the self. But fewer people realize that in his later years, Carl Jung came up with a truly fascinating idea that the set of natural numbers, numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, comes from an archetype. The archetype that he called the archetype of order. So this way, Carl Jung established a link between mathematics and psychology. And in this episode, I am going to take this idea much further. I'm going to propose that all mathematical objects and all mathematical ideas come from archetypes, come from our collective unconscious. And therefore, mathematics gives us an objective, scientific approach to the study of the human mind, to the study of human psychology. While physics is the study of the external physical world, the outer cosmos, if you will, mathematics is the study of our inner mental world, our inner cosmos. And in particular, when we bring mathematical archetypes in our collective awareness, when we integrate them, to borrow the term used by psychologists, new dimensions of reality open up for us. We'll discuss all of this in this episode, and I will present some concrete examples. Welcome to the Aftermath. In episode 1 of the Aftermath, and you can find a link to it in the description of this video, we discuss the remarkable fact that mathematical objects cannot be found in the physical world around us. We do not perceive them with our five senses. Sometimes, approximations of mathematical objects could be found in the physical world, as is the case for the objects of Euclidean geometry, such as points, lines, and circles on the plane. But for the vast majority of mathematical objects, there is nothing in the physical world around us that has any semblance of them. For example, in mathematics, we study geometric shapes of arbitrary dimension and even infinite dimensional geometric shapes. And in math, we also study things like esoteric numerical systems like periodic numbers, infinite dimensional Hilbert spaces, and infinite sets which correspond to the so-called inaccessible cardinals, not the kind of cardinals that we ordinarily talk about. None of these objects exist in the physical world around us, and yet we have the capacity to imagine them, to conjure them up in our minds. How interesting. In episode 1, I quoted Charles Darwin, who suggested that we perceive mathematical objects through an extra sense. We could call it the mathematical sense of the mind. And this sixth sense, this mathematical sense of the mind, has a remarkable property. Through it, we perceive all mathematical objects in exactly the same way. You and I perceive the mathematical objects of a straight line, as we discussed in episode 1, in exactly the same way. Whereas we perceive physical objects in the physical reality through our five senses slightly differently, from different angles, from different positions, and so on. Based on all this, in episode 1, I suggested that our minds must be somehow connected. And today we will discuss how this connection could be facilitated. Now, I realize that the idea that our minds are connected may sound outlandish, but in fact, it is one of the main tenets of analytic psychology developed by Carl Jung and his school in the 20th century. Carl Jung suggested that there exists a psychic substrate which is common to all humans, which he called collective unconscious, to which all of our minds are connected. And through this common psychic substrate, through this collective unconscious, we could say our minds are connected to each other. This is similar to how our bodies are all connected to the environment. And through the environment, they are connected to each other. So that's the first idea, the idea of Carl Jung, the idea of collective unconscious. And I'm going to augment it with my own proposal, my hypothesis, if you will, that all mathematical objects and ideas actually reside in the collective unconscious as the archetypes. So there is a lot to unpack here. We should talk about what we mean by collective unconscious, what we mean by unconscious in general. What are the archetypes? What does it mean that mathematical objects and ideas are archetypal? What does it imply? And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. First things first, what is collective unconscious? Carl Jung himself defined it as follows. Collective unconscious is the part of the unconscious that is not individual but universal. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behavior that are more or less the same everywhere in all individuals. It is, in other words, identical in all men and women, and thus constitutes a common psychic substrate of a suprapersonal nature. Suprapersonal meaning that it transcends personal nature, which is present in every one of us. And then he says the contents of the collective unconscious are known as archetypes. This word will be very important in this episode and in the future episodes. So what are the archetypes? Carl Jung's favorite student, well, in my opinion, Marie-Louise von Franz, described them as follows. Jung understood archetypes to be inborn dispositions or unobservable psychic structures that in recurring typical situations produce similarly structured ideas, thoughts, emotions, and fantasy motifs. So the crucial point here is that archetypes are certain structural elements, or you could say building blocks, or persistent patterns of the collective unconscious. And Jung himself studied various examples of archetypes, the most famous of which are the shadow, anima, animus, and the self. We'll talk about the first of them, the shadow, in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about how to connect Jung's notion of archetypes to mathematics. My proposal, my hypothesis, is that every mathematical object corresponds to a particular archetype in our collective unconscious. I will call these archetypes the mathematical archetypes, and as we will see in a moment, they have some very special properties. Remember what we discussed just now for general archetypes, that an archetype produces similarly structured ideas, thoughts, emotions, and so on. So my point is that mathematical archetypes produce the mental images of the corresponding mathematical objects in our minds. Or, put differently, when we imagine some mathematical objects, like a straight line, or a plane, or a circle, and so on, what we are doing, we're actually accessing the corresponding archetypes in our collective unconscious, accessing through that mathematical sense of the mind that we discussed. So let's be more concrete and talk about a specific mathematical object, namely the mathematical object of a straight line that we discussed in episode 1. And what I mean is an abstract idealized straight line that has zero thickness, that is absolutely straight, not wiggly, like the approximate lines we find in physical reality, and one that extends to infinity in both directions. You and I can both imagine this idealized abstract straight line, even though it is nowhere to be found in the physical world around us. And now my hypothesis is that what happens when we are imagining a straight line or conjuring it up in our minds, we are actually accessing the corresponding archetype, the archetype of a straight line, located in our collective unconscious, you see. Or we could say that at this moment, the archetype of a straight line is activated and it produces the image of a straight line, the mental image of a straight line in our minds. A crucial point here is that the source of this idealized abstract straight line can be found neither in the physical world around us nor in each of our individual minds. The source of the straight line that we are imagining in our minds is actually located in our collective unconscious as the archetype of a straight line. That's a good example of how we interact with mathematical archetypes and how mathematical archetypes lead us to imagine or conjure up mathematical objects in our minds. The same, in my view, applies to every other mathematical object. Each of them corresponds to a particular archetype in our collective unconscious. And the point is that these archetypes have a very special property which distinguishes them from other archetypes, and of which there are plenty, obviously. There are many non-mathematical archetypes in our collective unconscious, and I am not suggesting by far that everything can somehow be reduced to mathematical archetypes. Not at all. Mathematical archetypes represent a particular class of archetypes in our collective unconscious. And archetypes of this kind, these mathematical archetypes, have a special property. What is the special property? The special property is that when this archetype is activated, and when it sort of throws an image into my mind, into your mind, and so on, what we're experiencing, what we're imagining, what we are conjuring up is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. The way the archetypes corresponding to mathematical objects are experienced by all of us is exactly the same. Now, that's quite different from how other archetypes that Jung and others have studied are experienced in our human lives. To explain that, let's consider a specific example, the archetype of a shadow.
Stimulants work. That's why 20 million Americans use them, but there's downsides.
My hands shake. I can't fall asleep.
My crap.
The archetype of shadow is realized or manifested as the set of those aspects of the personality of an individual that are seen by this individual as incompatible with their conscious attitude, incompatible with how they want to present themselves to the world, to other people, their persona, if you will. And therefore, these qualities, these personality traits are denied and repressed. So they are kind of pushed into the unconscious of this individual, from where they are trying to plot their escape, you see. So, for example, suppose I think that I am this sort of level-headed person, that I'm always nice to everyone, I never raise my voice, I am reasonable, I'm not combative or argumentative, and so on. But in reality, it may well be that actually I can get triggered, and in those situations I kind of lose my cool, like I lose my temper, and I become angry and maybe even nasty, and I start shouting and things like that, especially when overwhelmed with some situations, or when I'm tired, or when I'm sick, and so on. You see, but even with all that, I might still be in denial. I might still be in denial that I act this way, even though my friends and family are well aware of it, but they kind of hesitate to bring this to my attention, you see. So we could say that in this case, I'm at the mercy of the archetype. I am under the spell of this archetype, you see. I'm trying to keep it under wraps, but I really can't, because, you know, think about it, is the way Jung spoke about it, is it's a kind of a complex in my unconscious, which is charged with energy. And this energy has to go somewhere, right? So where could this energy go? One common thing that could happen in this case is that I would project my unconscious trait, that's this undesirable unconscious trait, onto other people. So in the case that I described, it would mean that I would surround myself with people with short temper, who are prone to get triggered and overreact and shout and so on, right? And so then every time this happens, I would be like, wow, why is it that I'm always surrounded by this type of people? Why, you know, they're always shouting, they're always angry and so on. When I am Mr. Nice Guy, I never do that, you see? So that's a classic example of a projection. And in fact, Carl Jung spoke of archetypes as projection-making factors. Of course, the result of this, the result of my denial, is that I start blaming those people. It's always these other people who are doing the wrong. You see, like never me, it's always these other people. And so I'm going to fight with them, and I'm going to speak badly of them and so on, right? Sound familiar? Well, if so, drop some comments and describe some similar situations, which, by the way, I want to say, you know, I'm not necessarily speaking about myself. It's not necessarily that I am like that. Or am I? It's interesting that I have chosen this bad temper as an example, right? So I don't know. Maybe there is some truth to it. Okay, we'll find out. But the point is that there is a better way. I can stop blaming others. I can stop saying that other people are at fault. I can look at myself in the mirror and I can admit to myself that actually, yes, I do have this trait. It does have something to do with my own personality. And then if I'm honest with myself, if I become aware of the fact that this trait is within me, now I have a choice how to act. And so, yes, if I can act as Mr. Nice Guy, I can act in a reasonable way, in a level-headed way, but also I will recognize that there are some situations where, yes, it is appropriate to act forcefully, to express myself forcefully, maybe to express a protest against something, or indignation, or even, or outrage. But the thing is that now that I'm aware that I can act this way, my response will be measured. It will be appropriate. I will not simply be reacting or overreacting. And that makes a world of difference. So you see, this process of honestly looking inside and recognizing these traits that previously I didn't want to admit to myself, this process is called the process of integration of the shadow. And it is extremely important because you know what's happening in the world today. We can see that it's not only happening at the individual level, it also happens at the level of society or the level of political parties, where let's say you have one political party which is projecting some of their traits, or members of the party projecting onto members of the other party, and vice versa. And so then they tend to blame each other, they tend to vilify each other, and so on, instead of engaging in productive and fruitful dialogue. You know, I'm not saying this is happening, but it could be happening, right? So, I mean, theoretically speaking. So, integration of the shadow, that is the path. Not blaming other people, not projecting onto other people. So here's what Carl Jung said about this. Integration of the shadow cannot take place and be put to a useful purpose unless one can admit the tendency bound up with the shadow and allow them some measure of realization, tempered, of course, with the necessary criticism. This leads to disobedience and self-disgust, right? But that leads us to self-reliance, without which individuation is unthinkable. So that's a beautiful quote by Carl Jung, and at the end of it, he talks about individuation, which is a very important term in Jungian psychology, which means the process of becoming self-aware, the process of becoming whole. And so, you see, that's very important because the main point, in my opinion, is that before integration, when I'm pretending that I don't possess this particular quality or this particular trait, I'm at its mercy. I'm under the spell of the archetype, and therefore I don't have a choice. My actions sometimes become automatic. They're driven by forces of which I'm not even aware, you see. And after integration, after I start seeing this sort of darker side of my personality, I do have a choice. To me, that's the most important thing. No choice, there is a choice. That's what integration means. And that's why it's such an important process. And that's the difference between living unconsciously and living consciously, being self-aware. All right, let's go back to math. Let's go back to mathematics because, of course,
I just wanted to insert one little additional tidbit as the Jungian astrologer in the group, that one way you can tell whether you or someone else is projecting is the degree of judgment that exists in whatever their perception is. The more rejecting and judgmental their denouncement of this trait, the more likely it is that it is a trait of their own that they are projecting onto another person. And the more matter of fact you are, you can say, well, yes, that they are this way, without a lot of venomous condemnation and judgment, the more likely that is to actually be true in a more objective sense, as far as anything can ever really be objective. But that's a real litmus test for, and I bring it up also because that shows part of the harmfulness of the limitation of the phenomenon of projection, and why it's important, as they say in Jungian terms, to eat the shadow or absorb it consciously, because it will liberate you. You won't be having these knee-jerk reactions to other people and never seeing yourself in the mirror. And the goal of Jungian psychology isn't enlightenment, it's wholeness.
And individuation.
And individuation is the process of achieving wholeness. So,
Thank you.
of course, the most important point of this episode is that my hypothesis that all mathematical objects and ideas correspond to archetypes, right? So I spent some time talking to you about the archetype of a shadow because I wanted to emphasize three aspects of it, three aspects. So the first is how one can be under the spell of the archetype, or one could say influenced by the archetype without being aware of it. That's the first. Projection as a particular response of the psyche to being not aware, right? And the third is integration. All right, so being under the spell, projection, and integration. And so the point I'd like to make is that one could see exactly the same three aspects with mathematical archetypes as well. How interesting, right? So I'm going to illustrate it with a very specific archetype now, which I call the archetype of flat space. Before I explain this, I want to make two remarks. The first one is kind of more about terminology, because, you know, oftentimes you hear people say integration of the shadow, or more generally integration of a particular archetype. But in fact, the more correct way to put it would be to say integration of a particular manifestation of the archetype of shadow, or particular realization of this archetype. Because, you know, in principle, we have to distinguish, and Carl Jung has emphasized this many times, we have to distinguish archetype itself, which is, as we discussed, a kind of a general pattern in the collective unconscious. In one of his works, Carl Jung talked about archetypes as riverbeds along which the psychic current flows, which I think is a nice kind of poetic rendering, by poetic expression of what archetypes are. So these are the general patterns. And then we have to distinguish those general patterns from the way they are realized, the way they are manifested, the way they are represented in lives of specific individuals, which are always slightly different, you see. So let's say for me, the problem is my short temper. Again, I'm not saying that that's the case, however it may well be, right? So, okay. So it's kind of a little bit of a therapy session for me, what's going on, I suppose. Right? But for somebody else, it could be something different or something even opposite, right? So that's what I mean by saying that, yes, there is a difference between the archetype and its particular rendering or particular representation, realization, or manifestation. But, you know, just for brevity, people often say integration of the archetype instead of saying integration of a particular manifestation of the archetype, just for brevity. And that's what we will do as well, keeping in mind this distinction. So that's the first comment. Which, by the way, also, since we are talking about terminology, I also want to mention the following. There is a term psyche, and then there is a term mind, and for different people, it means different things. But for me, I use them interchangeably. They are synonyms for me. So just to clarify this point, oftentimes when people talk about the mind, they reference just the conscious aspect of the psyche. But I take a more general view of the mind being the entire psyche. That's the first comment. And the second comment I want to make is that, you know, this idea of a shadow, or the archetype of the shadow, has been expressed artistically in many beautiful books and movies. And of course, the most famous example of a book that is exploring this idea is the book by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I'm sure most of you know about. And as far as movies are concerned, there are also many great movies, but I would say my favorites are Face Off, directed by John Woo, and Fight Club by David Fincher, and Collateral by Michael Mann. Collateral is a film that I rewatched recently, and I was really quite struck by how these ideas are represented in this movie. I'm feeling tempted to do a kind of a little presentation on interpreting this film in the context of Jungian archetypes, and specifically the archetype of shadow. And if it's something that appeals to you, please drop a comment under the video so that, you know, perhaps we'll do it in one of the future episodes. What I like about this film and the way shadow is represented in it is that it shows that this repressed shadowy traits of our personality are not necessarily negative. They're not necessarily bad. They could be positive. For instance, it could be the trait of decisiveness or courage, you know, or being able to stand up for yourself. and take your chances and things like that. So that's why I'm kind of tempted to talk about it more. Now I'm going to talk about the archetype of
Jung said criminals have the most beautiful shadows that they're not aware of. They're often hidden from themselves. It's interesting.
flat space. I'm really excited to share this with you because I think it's a really great illustration of what we have talked about so far. So what is a flat space in mathematics? Well, first of all, there is a flat space of an arbitrary positive dimension. But let's start with the two-dimensional case, the two-dimensional flat space, also known as a plane. We discussed it in detail in episode 1. This is actually the arena of Euclidean geometry. Imagine a flat tabletop, or a page, or a computer screen, or a blackboard extended in all directions to infinity. And imagine that it has no thickness at all and is perfectly flat. Of course, there are no such planes in the physical world around us, as we discussed in detail in episode 1. We do not perceive them with our 5 senses. And yet, you and I have no trouble imagining or conjuring up these objects in our minds, right? So what does it mean? From the perspective of the hypothesis of mathematical archetypes that I have articulated earlier, this means that we have the capacity to access an archetype in our collective unconscious. And I call that archetype the archetype of flat space, or rather, in this case, two-dimensional flat space, the archetype of a plane. We can access the archetype of a plane, and that moment when we access it, we are imagining or conjuring up this image of a perfectly flat, idealized two-dimensional space or perfectly flat plane in our minds. And so what I would like to explain now is that this archetype has the same features as psychological archetypes, more familiar archetypes, like the archetype of a shadow. For example, we can get under the influence of this archetype of the plane. You see, we can get under its spell, right? And in fact, this has happened not that long ago when people believed that Earth is flat. That's when we were under the spell of this archetype.
This is an ad.
Have you ever heard of an economy being taxed into prosperity?
What does it actually mean to say that Earth is flat? It means that you take this idealized perfect plane and you superimpose it onto the surface of the planet Earth, you see. Not just saying that it's a good approximation of a small neighborhood where I live, where it actually is a good approximation, but extrapolating it to the entire planet, right? Where it definitely becomes problematic, as I will explain in a moment. So what evidence did people have for doing that? Especially because in those days, people couldn't really do, long distance travel and so on. So this was an idea, right? It was not something that was based on factual evidence. But I would go even further and say not only there was no evidence for it, people didn't even realize that there was a question, because they didn't know there was a choice. They didn't consider the alternatives. For instance, that Earth is round, that it is well approximated by a sphere, not by a plane. And this is a very typical situation of being influenced by an archetype. When we are influenced by an archetype, when we are under the spell of an archetype, as we have discussed, we don't have a choice. We don't realize that there is a choice. Our behavior is in some sense automatic, you see, and that's exactly what's happening here. So what do we do in this situation? We start projecting, as we discussed in the case of the archetype of shadow. So the difference is that in the case of an archetype of shadow, I would project my qualities, the character traits that I deny to myself, I would project them onto other people. But in this case, we are projecting the archetype of flat space on the entire planet, on the planet Earth, and saying, oh, okay, well, I see that Earth is approximately flat. Near me, it must be flat everywhere. But I'm not actually articulating it to myself this way, because in those days, people actually didn't understand the mathematical concept of a plane. That's what I'm trying to say. They had not yet integrated this archetype. They were still under the spell of this archetype. That's why it was natural for them that this archetype was sort of acting in ways that were unbeknownst to them. That this archetype led them to believe that the planet Earth is flat, even though they were not even realizing that there was a question about what the shape of the Earth is. They took it as an axiom, if you will. How interesting, huh? In other words, it's exactly the same situation in which I would find myself, where I am under the spell of archetype of shadow, where I have convinced myself that I never get triggered, that I'm level-headed, I never lose my temper, and so on, even though reality is quite different. But I'm in denial of it, right? So how to get out of this bind? And we discussed that in the case of archetype of shadow, and likewise for all other psychological archetypes, the way out is to integrate it. So what does it mean to integrate a mathematical archetype? Quite simply, it means to understand what the corresponding mathematical concept is, or to absorb this notion into our conscious awareness. That's exactly what mathematical discovery is. And that's why mathematics is so important, if you think about it. In fact, one of the first philosophers who understood that Earth was not flat and sort of got out of this bind was Pythagoras. Pythagoras and Pythagoreans understood what the concept of flat space was. They understood what it is mathematically. They understood also what sphere was, and they could contrast a plane, the flat two-dimensional space, and the sphere. So suddenly, once they understood and absorbed this into their conscious awareness, they saw that there was a choice. They realized that the Earth doesn't have to be flat, because there are other geometric shapes that exist, that there are other mathematical geometric shapes that actually could give us better approximation to the surface, to the shape of the surface of the Earth. And then they start looking for evidence. But most importantly, they were able to pose the question, what is the shape? You can only pose this question when you realize that there are alternatives. This is the point I'm trying to make. And that's exactly what unites the archetype of a plane or any other mathematical archetype, in my opinion, and a psychological archetype of shadow. The true process of integration means that you get to the point where you realize that there is a question, where you realize that there is a choice. Until then, your behavior is automatic. You're not even aware that you're doing something. You see, it was kind of unconscious to people. They were convinced that Earth is flat without any evidence. Pythagoreans bring the archetype of a plane into their conscious awareness. They start seeing that there are other alternatives. They pose the question and then realize that there is a choice. So that's exactly the mechanics. That's exactly the process of integration of an archetype that Jung and others have proposed in analytic psychology. And once the Pythagoreans integrated the archetype of flat space, once they understood what it actually means, that's when they actually could ask the question, is it actually true? Is it true that the Earth is flat? Or is it possible that it is spherical? And so on, you see. So, in fact, there was plenty of evidence that Earth is not flat, but is round. But people didn't bother to look. So, for example, one way it could be discovered, even, in those days when people could not travel long distances, they could discover it by looking at the moon during lunar eclipse, which was, it's kind of a rare occurrence, but not exceedingly rare. When you look at the surface of the moon during the lunar eclipse, you see that the Earth throws shadow, no pun intended. The Earth throws a shadow on the moon, and that shadow is not flat. That shadow is round. So that's one way in which people could discover it. And yet, it did not happen until the time of Pythagoras, 2,500 years ago. There were probably other philosophers, Greek philosophers around that time, who saw the same thing. But around the same time, and my contention is that the reason why it was not seen before is because until that point, the archetype of flat space had not yet been integrated. That concept was not yet understood, was not yet brought into conscious awareness. And after it was brought into conscious awareness, that's when people start seeing evidence to the contrary, to what was considered is an unquestionable postulate, you see, of flatness of the Earth. And so that's one way to see it, but there are plenty of other ways. For instance, you could observe how the ship disappears under the horizon line as it sails away. First the hull disappears, right? First the hull disappears, and then the mast. It's not like the ship becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and kind of withers away. You see, and that of course suggests that the curvature of the surface of the Earth. So this last argument is due to Aristotle, which was a couple hundred years later. And again, people could have observed that earlier, but they didn't. And the question that I'm asking, why? To me, the answer seems obvious. It's exactly the same phenomenon as why did I not discover before that I actually am prone to, throwing a fit or something, or being triggered and so on. Why didn't I notice it before? Because I was under the spell of the archetype. So I was projecting it onto others.
If your neck looks like this, you need to watch this video. When you sit at your desk or use your phone, your head protrudes forward.
Right? And it's only after I integrated it that I start realizing that that's what is happening. Same way with the idea of flat Earth. It's a projection of the archetype of the flat two-dimensional space, the archetype of a plane. It's happening when it is unconscious to me. Once the archetype is integrated, and at first it happened to a handful of philosophers and mathematicians such as Pythagoras, but it's already a big deal, because if you already have one human being who has integrated it, this makes a tremendous difference, because of course after that this knowledge is shared, and somehow other minds are also become attuned to this idea, you see. So that's why mathematical research is so important in my opinion, because it actually opens new vistas, it opens new dimensions in our perception of reality. Mathematics opens up new possibilities which we didn't even realize existed, you see. So we go from this naive, narrow-minded, simplistic view of the world to a much more sophisticated, much richer perspective, as is the case when we realize that Earth is not flat, but it is curved. And so, yet, the power of this archetype of flat space is tremendous. And so we've been under the spell of it for a long time. And, we got out of it. But guess what? I believe that we're still under the spell of the archetype of the three-dimensional flat space. Let me repeat that. We are still under the spell of the archetype of the three-dimensional flat space. And what I mean by that is that the way we perceive the world we live in, the space we live in, we perceive it as a three-dimensional flat space, not as a curved space. Have you ever considered the possibility that the world we live in, not the planet Earth, not the surface of the planet Earth, that's settled. It's not flat. It's not even spherical. It's more sophisticated than spherical, but it's a good approximation to say that the surface of the Earth is spherical. It's a two-dimensional sphere. Have you ever considered the possibility that the world we live in, the space we live in, is actually not the flat three-dimensional space, but is a three-dimensional sphere, for example? Do you even know what the three-dimensional sphere is? You see? So most people, I don't think, have thought about it. Now, I'm a mathematician, so yes, I can explain to you what the three-dimensional flat space is, what the three-dimensional sphere is. So we're kind of in the situation of Pythagoras 2,500 years ago, when Pythagoras and Pythagoreans understood clearly what the flat space, two-dimensional flat space, the plane is, what the sphere is, and the contrast between the two. But now one dimension higher. Now we're not talking about the surface of the Earth anymore. We're talking about something much bigger, the space we live in, the space we inhabit. This space, is it flat or is it not flat? Have you ever thought about it? Now, I'm a mathematician, and I have thought about it. And yet, I am still under the spell. I still believe that it is flat. Intuitively, unconsciously, I'm still imagining this space, the sky, the clouds, the trees, everything around us. I'm still imagining that it all exists embedded into a three-dimensional space where you have three Cartesian coordinates. I will explain this in a moment, what I mean by that. You see? So maybe I was too optimistic when I said that integrating an archetype means just absorbing the corresponding mathematical concept into our conscious awareness. Because yes, I do, as a mathematician, I do understand what the three-dimensional space is, a three-dimensional flat space is. I do understand what the three-dimensional sphere is, but I'm incapable of even entertaining the possibility of seeing the world, the three-dimensional world, as being bent, as being curved. Because one of the consequences of the archetype of flat space is that it makes us believe that the curved shapes, even though they do exist, of course, we can think of a sphere, but they have to always be embedded. They have always be inside a flat space of higher dimensions. So, for example, a sphere is two-dimensional, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that the sphere is two-dimensional. The sphere, we always think of a sphere as being inside a three-dimensional flat space. So, therefore, if we want to think of a three-dimensional sphere, it will have to be embedded into a four-dimensional flat space, right? But actually, that's not true. In the 19th century, German mathematician Bernhard Riemann came up with a beautiful theory which shows that we can actually treat geometric shapes, what we now call Riemannian manifolds, as standalone geometric structures or standalone geometric shapes without any reference to a larger ambient flat space. In other words, we can treat the two-dimensional sphere, the ordinary two-dimensional sphere, as a standalone Riemannian manifold, as a standalone geometric shape, without any reference to embedding it to a three-dimensional, to the three-dimensional flat space. And likewise, three-dimensional sphere doesn't have to be embedded into four-dimensional flat space, and so on. So I understand this theory, and I'm happy to share it with you and to share my knowledge with you. But there is another component to it. What I'm trying to say, there is a psychological component that even though I have understood, and many mathematicians around the world have understood this theory, I wonder how many of us actually are capable of imagining, visualizing a three-dimensional curved shape, like a three-dimensional sphere. But I do believe that it is possible. And in fact, this reminds me that Carl Jung spoke about conscious and unconscious elements in our lives as the difference between those, the range of frequencies which are available to us through vision, through hearing, and so on. And as you know, these ranges are quite limited. And for instance,
never sue the other driver after a car accident. There's a better way to get paid a way bigger check without having to go to court.
There are animals who are capable of perceiving ultrasound and so on, or infrared, ultraviolet frequencies, right? So today, human beings have limited capacity of perceiving parts of the spectrum, of visual spectrum or a spectrum of sound. But there is no reason to believe that this is how it is meant to be. Evolution, in my opinion, is in part about expanding this range of possibilities, expanding this range of frequencies which are available to us. But if so, then maybe there are also other dimensions in space that we do not yet see, we do not yet have the capacity to see. Mathematics shows to us that these geometric shapes of higher dimensions are real. They're real as mathematical objects. But if so, there is no reason to believe that they somehow cannot be realized in the universe, in the physical universe around us. But to be able to perceive them, we have to integrate the corresponding archetypes. You see, so this is my main point. We have to integrate mathematical archetypes to be able to get access to other dimensions of life in a generalized sense. And just learning the mathematically is perhaps just the first step. And of course, we have to be on the same page. So you and I understand the same thing when we say three-dimensional sphere, or when we say four-dimensional flat space, and so on. And that, I hope, will be the launch pad for us, that you and I together, we will be able to make the next step. And making the next step is the full integration of the archetype. The full integration of the archetype means that suddenly we will learn, we will be able to visualize those shapes. So we are not blocking ourselves anymore psychologically, because this is one place where I believe that mathematics and psychology kind of intrude on each other. There is a tension between them, that even though mathematical knowledge expands our view, but then there is a next step of applying it psychologically, of embodying this, of living these archetypes. That's what I'm talking about. So let's talk about what I mean by a flat space versus a curved space in the case of a plane and the three-dimensional flat space, and then we'll wrap it up. Let's talk about the difference between the plane, the flat two-dimensional space, and the sphere. And the way I would like to explain this is by saying that flatness actually can be related to a coordinate grid. So this coordinate grid is quite familiar to us. For instance, here's a page from a notebook that I have where you have a bunch of parallel vertical lines and parallel horizontal lines. So you can think of the page as being tiled by little squares, and all of the squares have the same size. And the point is that as you expand, as you enlarge this page, you can continue tiling it with these squares of the same size. Perhaps a more down-to-earth way to talk about it is to think in terms of a bathroom floor with tiles of the same size, the square tiles of the same size, and think about renovating your house and making your bathroom larger and larger until it becomes infinite bathroom. And this infinite plane, which will be the floor of your bathroom, or at least approximately, if it doesn't bend too much, it will be tiled regularly all the way to infinity by the tiles of the same size. That's flatness, you see. So you can tile the plane by square tiles all the way to infinity. And now contrast that with the sphere. Now on the sphere, we can do something similar. We could also introduce a kind of a curved grid by using longitude and latitude, which are two coordinates on the sphere. Which, by the way, this is what I mean when I say that the sphere is two-dimensional, is because a location on the sphere can be pinpointed by using only two numbers, the longitude and latitude. So we can use longitude and latitude to tile the sphere by this kind of curved tiles, but you see that they all have different sizes. And that's the difference. These curved tiles are bigger closer to the equator, and then they become smaller and smaller as you approach the North Pole and the South Pole. So definitely very different from the plane. And of course also another aspect of it is that there will be finitely many tiles if I fix the increment in longitude and latitude, whereas on the plane there are infinitely many of them. In three dimensions there is something similar. A flat three-dimensional space cannot be filled with two-dimensional tiles, but it can be filled with bricks. So imagine filling a room with bricks of the same size, and now expand this room further and further. So that's the idea of the three-dimensional flat space that I talked about earlier. The three-dimensional flat space can be completely filled with bricks of the same size, and these bricks are like boxes, right? So they have 90-degree angles, between different edges. So this is the equivalent of saying that you can impose on the three-dimensional flat space a coordinate grid with three coordinate axes x, y, and z, similarly to what we can do with a plane, where we could have a coordinate system with two coordinate axes x and y. So that's the idea of the three-dimensional flat space. So I hope we are on the same page, and please do drop a comment under the video to let me know whether my explanations make sense.
If you're someone who cares about healthy eating and increasing the protein in your diet, listen up, because we have the ultimate protein hack, Paleo Valley's whey protein with colostrum. Here are 5 reasons why.
So that's the idea of the three-dimensional flat space. And now, what's the analog of a sphere in this setting? So it should be something now three-dimensional, which has 3 coordinates. The two-dimensional sphere won't do, the usual sphere, because it only has 2 coordinates, longitude and latitude. The three-dimensional sphere is going to have 3 intrinsic coordinates. Okay, so I'm going to just leave it open and kind of let your imagination run wild. I don't want to impose my ideas on you. Maybe you're already visualizing it much better than I do, and that would be great. So then please share that with me and with other audience members, right? So we'll talk about it next time, because I don't want to overload you with information. I think we've covered quite a lot of territory today. So before I go, I want to mention two things. So the first thing is that the question I posed earlier is whether the space we live in is a flat three-dimensional space. And now I have articulated what I mean by that. I have essentially given you a mathematical definition of the flat three-dimensional space. And so the question that I asked is whether the space we live in, the three-dimensional space, is flat or curved. And an example of a curved three-dimensional space or curved three-dimensional shape, or more precisely curved three-dimensional Riemannian manifold, is a three-dimensional sphere. And again, I am not giving you a definition, a mathematical definition of the three-dimensional sphere, because I don't want to prejudice you. Maybe you have your own way of perceiving it, of visualizing it. And in that case, I'm really curious. How do you do that? In any case, we'll discuss it on the next episode. But I want to explain one other aspect of this. I pose a question about what is the shape of the space we live in. But actually, this question is not as clearly defined as one might think. And the reason is that after Einstein's special and general relativity theories, we know that we cannot separate the three spatial dimensions and the one time dimension in a universal fashion. It actually requires certain choices. So therefore, there is no such thing as an absolute space. There is such a thing as a four-dimensional space-time, but not the notion of a particular three-dimensional space. You can slice a four-dimensional space-time into different slices, but there isn't a canonical universal way to do it. It depends on the observer, and it depends on certain choices that the observer is making. So the jury is still out, and we will discuss it next time, what it means. And the second point I want to make is that I have found that a number of distinguished mathematicians and theoretical physicists are on record talking about the unconscious as being present in their creative process. I take it as a kind of a indirect confirmation of the hypothesis of mathematical archetypes that we talked about in this episode. So here's a quote from Albert Einstein. "I have no doubt that our thinking goes on for the most part without use of words, and to a considerable degree unconsciously. For how otherwise should it happen that we sometimes wonder quite spontaneously about some experience? This wondering appears to occur when an experience comes into conflict with a world of concepts already sufficiently fixed within us. Whenever such a conflict is experienced sharply and intensely, it reacts back upon our world of thought in a decisive way." It almost sounds like a quote from a book about analytic psychology, from a book about integration of archetypes, like Archetype of Shadow, doesn't it? How interesting. So here is a quote from Eugene Wigner, a great physicist and Nobel Prize winner. He says, "Unlike most thinking that goes on in the upper consciousness, the really relevant mathematical thinking is not done in words. In fact, it happens somewhere so deep in the subconscious." Here he uses the term subconscious, which, sometimes people use this term instead of the term unconscious, but meaning the same thing. So deep in the subconscious that the thinker is usually not even aware of what is going on inside. Again, how similar to the way we talk about the unconscious aspects of our personality and so on. So here is André Weil, a great French mathematician. By the way, recently I did a couple of conversations, interviews with Kurt Jai-Mungel on his TOE podcast about new developments in the Langlands program, as well as the sort of general setup of the Langlands program. And André Weil played a big role in this discussion. So if you're curious about the Langlands program, if you're curious about some of the new advances in modern mathematics, I highly recommend those two conversations that we have. And the links are, of course, under the video. So here is what André Weil said. "Every mathematician worthy of the name has experienced, if only rarely, the state of lucid exaltation in which one thought succeeds another as if miraculously, and in which the unconscious, however one interprets this..."
Did you want to say something?
No.
Say it.
Oh,
No,
just get the ad out of the way. Get rid of the ad. Skip it.
This word seems to play a role. That's André Weil, a great French mathematician. And here is another great French mathematician, Henri Poincaré, who wrote, "It is by logic that we prove, but by intuition that we discover." So to him, intuition actually was not something that existed in the conscious realm, but in fact was a tool of connecting our minds to the unconscious, as he articulated elsewhere. And interesting enough, Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Carl Jung's students whom I mentioned a number of times, she wrote in one of her works that Henri Poincaré actually deserved credit as someone who independently discovered the idea of unconscious. Alongside, she credited him alongside Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. So of course we should mention Sigmund Freud as someone who also theorized the unconscious, and Freud was Jung's mentor for some time. Then they kind of parted their ways and their theories diverged. However, some of the elements of the theory of unconscious that we find in Jung can be traced back to the ideas of Sigmund Freud. But Henri Poincaré is also credited with independently discovering the unconscious by Marie-Louise von Franz, mathematician Henri Poincaré. So how interesting too, right? And finally, I want to mention the great...
I'm going to lose it. It was Einstein who said something almost identical, that most of his best concepts came to him intuitively. And it was only later that he worked out the math. And apparently he was very resistant to math, and he had to really labor to do that, or sometimes even give it to somebody else to do it for him. But the ideas came to him intuitively. So while we're on that.
Indian mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan, who was not formally trained in mathematics. He lived at the beginning of, more or less, at the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century, was not formally trained in mathematics, but made astounding discoveries that dazzle us to this day. In fact, some of his conjectures have not been proved to this day. And Ramanujan said that many of his formulas were shown to him in his dreams. The family deity, goddess Namagiri, would come to him and write formulas on a screen, and as soon as he woke up, he would commit them to writing, filling his famous notebooks, you see. He was not even formally trained as a mathematician. This is absolutely fascinating story, and I will probably devote an entire episode of the Aftermath to him at some point in the future. But here I just want to say how interesting mathematics and dreams, because you see, today we discussed how discovery of mathematics could be interpreted as integration of mathematical archetypes. So in Jung's approach to archetypes, archetypes manifest themselves primarily in dreams, as archetypal images in dreams, also in fairy tales and myths. You can find similar elements in fairy tales and myths across cultures. Another topic that deserves a longer discussion. But I just want to point out that Ramanujan is someone where these two ways in which archetypes make themselves known come together, dreams and mathematics. He dreamed up his mathematical formulas, you see.
Meet Glowforge. It can transform a photo into a wallet.
All right, let's wrap this up. There are many interesting topics to discuss, and we will discuss them in the next episodes, such as curvature of space-time versus curvature of space, Riemannian manifolds, such as the three-dimensional sphere. I also want to talk about the history of non-Euclidean geometry. You see, Euclid, of course, deserves a lot of credit for his explorations of the two-dimensional flat space and the three-dimensional flat space that we discussed today, because he codified them in his books called Elements, as we discussed in episode 1. He actually framed the theory of the spaces and various objects inside them, such as lines, points, triangles, circles, and so on. He codified it in terms of what we call today a formal system, which was a tremendous advance. But on the flip side, it seems to me that the theory was viewed as so beautiful that in a sense it kind of paralyzed mathematicians for quite some time. They didn't make the next step of discovering the non-Euclidean geometry. It took almost 2,000 years. It's a story that really is very much relevant to our discussion of connections between mathematics and psychology. I also want to talk about another great Greek philosopher, Plato, and his theory of Platonic forms. Carl Jung actually gave credit to Plato and considered Plato's theory of Platonic forms as a precursor to Jung's theory of the archetypes. There are some differences between them, however, and we'll discuss them in later episodes. I also want to talk about connections between Jungian theory of collective unconscious and Eastern wisdom traditions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and others. That's also a fascinating topic for discussion. We'll also talk about other mathematical archetypes, such as the archetype of natural numbers, which was the first mathematical archetype proposed by Carl Jung himself, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode. I want to thank all of you for your comments on episode 1. They were very interesting and very valuable to me. I have read all of them, even if I have not responded to all of them, and I appreciate you very much for those comments, questions, and suggestions. And I hope that you will comment on this video as well, and I look forward to continuing our dialogue. I want to leave you with this quote from Carl Jung. Everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestation, and the personality too desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions and to experience itself as a whole. Thank you for watching, and see you on the next episode of The Aftermath.
Get out of screen share. Stop share. So there you have it. Marjorie, any comments?
Oh God, I wouldn't know where to begin, and I'm afraid I would never end. It's,
Well, then
it's
we'll have to get the hook out.
so rich. There's just so much there. But one thing I feel prompted to say in kind of defense of Jung and his ideas is that he saw the archetypes as actually existent in the universe and not just figments of our psyches and minds or imagination or kind of a human creation or invention at all. He saw us as coming from them and not them coming from us. And it took me a long time to understand that and what the significance of that is. I want you to move over this way.
What?
Like that, yeah. Because it's they're objectively pre-existent. And he would say that they are dreaming us as much as we are dreaming them.
And there's iterations and evolutions of both.
Right. And so, for example, we could say there was the Christ archetype before there was the incarnation known as Jesus Christ. We think of that as like two names, that Christ was his last name. But the archetype of the Christ was Greek, and it was there a long time before it was sort of inhabited or lived by a man named Jesus, that Christ was applied to him as, the Christos was a much older archetype. And I think of them as having a period of percolation before they fully manifest or express in actual life and in our consciousness. And there's some very mysterious kind of synchronicity that goes on with that. And for example, as an astrologer, I'll say the precession of the equinox and the changing signs on the horizon at the moment of dawn, that as that moves backwards, apparently from our point of view, through the zodiac, and that's when it percolated to the surface that this man was born who somehow seemed to really meet the characteristic. Who knows if he's really a descendant of the house of David or not, but there were enough, you could check off enough of the boxes to say, okay, this guy here fits this archetype that's been waiting for somebody to come live it out. And I think in the East, they have the same view of, let's say, the Dalai Lama's incarnation, that he was anticipated by the sages who were watching signs like that in the heavens and expecting him to come along then and there, more or less. You know, there's even some controversy about whether the person we recognize as the Dalai Lama is the real one. But, you know, it's just interesting. And we don't really understand or acknowledge how much Jung's concept of the archetypes is bound up with synchronicity, and how deeply Pauli and Jung went into the concept of synchronicity. And Jung's writing on the subject changed so much over the years because his understanding of it was changing so much. So he completely contradicts himself at different points. And you have to put it together and say, well, that he was, 30 years younger when he said that. And he did think something completely different 30 years later. And actually, that's what's happened to me. I think it's more causal than I originally thought. I don't really know how it operates or what the ultimate causes are, but it's bound together, synchronicity and the archetypes. And Jung would say, when you're really in the field of an archetype, when it's really got a lot of influence over you, it's bigger than you are. It's not something in your head. It's larger than your life even. And you're in that, you've encountered that, your sphere has entered into that sphere, and it's going to affect you. You're going to have different kinds of experiences and connections between experiences because of that. That the archetypes have their own energy, their own field of influence. And one way to look at that is what's going on in the sky, and synchronistically that'll show up. But it's not the only way, and it's not abstract. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And it's not completely made. It's organic and intrinsic. And that's what I didn't really understand, I think, until I was old enough. I don't think I was old enough to understand these ideas in my 20s. I don't think anybody really can.
And then just
Maybe
to pick
Ramanujan.
up on this, though, what Ron Cowan observed with information being everywhere, coating the walls of the foam that makes up space, and in everything around us, and having the ability to store and to have algorithms there that could, in fact, manipulate the forces that we see around us. In fact, manipulate time itself. That this embedded in all this, in these algorithms, is the archetypes. It's everywhere, but you have to realize this, and it will evolve, just like these algorithms. They start running, but then they evolve over time. They do different things, and you have to realize this. And We're just starting to come to grips with what all this means. But I credit Ron Cowan with making these observations, and we're simply trying to interpret what he saw. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Hit the end button. Bye-bye.
Good night, George.